Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on a source that, well, it fundamentally reshaped how entire generations view American history.
We're talking about Howard Zinn's monumental work, A People's History of the United States.
And this is a deep dive unlike any other, really.
It is, because when we discuss Zinn, we're not just, summarizing historical events. We're analyzing a deliberate and, frankly, controversial paradigm shift in how history is interpreted.
So our mission today is to explore U.S. history, not through that traditional lens of presidents and, generals and treaties.
Exactly. But explicitly through the eyes of the common people, the marginalized groups, and the resistance movements. And we're using Zinn's decades of sourced research as our guide.
And for you, the listener, I think the most important thing to grasp right away is Zinn's core critical thinking focus. He starts with the premise that history, by its very nature, is never just a neutral recitation of all the facts.
Right, it can't be. It always involves selection and emphasis.
He uses this analogy of a map, which I find really helpful.
Yeah, the cartographer has to flatten and distort the earth to make the map usable, right?
Exactly. And Zinn says a historian has to do something similar.
But he argues the historian's distortion it's far more profound than just a technical necessity. He says it's ideological.
Ideological. What does he mean by that, exactly?
Well, that any historical narrative is released into a world that's already defined by contending interests.
Economic, political, racial.
All of it. So the crucial question isn't if history is selective, but whose interests the chosen narrative supports.
And what stories get deliberately twisted or just left out entirely in the standard retelling.
The ones that become cultural gospel. And that is the challenging, critical framework we are going to use for every single period we cover today.
We're trying to understand the structure of power that Zinn argues is, well, hidden in plain sight.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting right at the foundation of American history. Zinn tackles this by immediately dismantling the whole heroic adventure myth around Christopher Columbus.
He does. He forces us to begin with the consequences. Zinn's history starts with the brutal initial encounter with the Arawak people on Hispaniola.
And he says the motivation is just laid bare in Columbus's own writings.
It is. It was gold and enslavement. He took Arawaks aboard his ships as prisoners and basically insisted they guide him to the gold source immediately.
The account of the Arawaks' peaceful nature, which Zinn draws from primary sources, just makes the violence that follows so much more shocking.
It does. They swam out to meet the ships. They were bringing gifts.
And within days, Columbus is demanding gold.
He is. And when two Indians failed to trade enough bows and arrows, Zinn recounts, they were run through with swords and just left to bleed to death, as an example.
Terrifying example.
And this quest for gold and labor led very rapidly to what Zinn just calls a complete genocide.
The Arawak population was forced into slave labor on these massive agricultural and mining estates.
Right, and Zinn doesn't just state this. He uses the raw data of population collapse to illustrate the sheer scale of the horror.
What were the numbers like?
The Arawak population, estimated in the hundreds of thousands initially, was reduced to maybe 50,000 by 1515 and then only 500 by 1550.
To give you clarity, these massive estates where native labor was exploited are known as encomiendas.
And the labor was so ferocious that within about a century and a half, the original Arawak population was completely wiped out on Hispaniola.
They just ceased to exist.
They were gone. And this is where the historical critique is so key.
Because he's relying on testimony from people who were there.
Yes, heavily on Bartolomé de las Casas, a young priest who was initially part of the conquest but later became this vehement critic of slavery. He documented the destruction in graphic detail.
What's fascinating here is how Zinn confronts the traditional narratives with this evidence.
He does. He directly confronts historian Samuel Eliot Morison.
And Morison actually acknowledges the outcome, right?
He does. Zinn quotes him as calling the result of Columbus's policy complete genocide.
What?
But Morison still frames the larger story as one of human progress.
And that's Zinn's central question.
That's his critique. How can you judge progress when it requires you to minimize or just sweep aside such an immense human catastrophe? It challenges the very moral calculus of history.
And that pattern of conquest of economic justification, it didn't stop there.
Sadly, no. It only deepened as Europeans moved into North America.
The English invaders, especially the Puritans, they needed some kind of excuse, right? A legal or philosophical reason for seizing territory that was obviously inhabited.
So they invented one.
Governor John Winthrop.
Of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, yeah. He declared Indian land a vacuum.
A vacuum.
A vacuum, because in his mind, the Native Americans hadn't subdued it in the European style with their kind of farming and ownership.
Which conveniently meant that Indians only held a natural right to the land.
Which didn't grant legal ownership, not a civil right, and that simple linguistic trick, that little piece of justification, rationalized centuries of subsequent theft.
And the violence that enforced this theft was systematic.
Completely. Zinn recounts the horrific outcome of the Pequot War in 1637.
The English surrounded a Pequot village.
They set fire to it and just shot down anyone who tried to escape. Zinn quotes the Puritan theologian Cotton Mather, who noted that no less than 600 Pequot souls were brought down to hell that day.
The violence was designed to be terrifying, to be total.
And the warfare wasn't just, conventional battles.
No. The source material reveals the dark reality of early biological warfare.
Against unified Indian tribes, like those in what's known as Pontiac's Conspiracy.
Which was this massive resistance movement.
A huge movement against British encroachment. And British forces, under General Geoffrey Amherst, deliberately distributed smallpox-infected blankets to negotiating chiefs.
And a calculated military tactic.
It was. And it contributed to this long-term demographic catastrophe Zinn documents. An estimated 10 million indigenous people north of Mexico were eventually reduced to less than 1 million.
Due to disease, starvation, and calculated military action.
The objective was clear. The land had to be cleared for European expansion. And, well, for profit.
So as the Native American population was decimated or pushed west, there was this relentless labor shortage.
Especially for the big cash crops in the South, like tobacco.
And the economic solution became black slaves.
Right. And this transition was built on a century of already profitable European slave trading. It wasn't new.
The inhumanity, it starts in the Middle Passage itself.
It does. Zinn described how slaves were chained to decks, packed in like fish.
Which resulted in just massive mortality.
Often 1 in 3 people dying on the voyage. It was an industrialized, calculated system of human trafficking. And it was all predicated on maximizing profits, even with this catastrophic loss of life.
What Zinn really emphasizes is that American racism wasn't just some organic hatred that sprang up.
No, it was the result of conditions that were engineered for extreme exploitation.
And then deliberately codified into law.
Exactly. For instance, in 1639, a Virginia law decreed that all persons except Negroes were to be armed.
A year later, a black servant named John Punch was sentenced to serve for the time of his natural life for running away.
While his 2 white comrades who ran with him just had their service lengthened.
That's the codification right there.
It's the beginning. This early legal framework was essential for establishing that structural difference between black slavery and white servitude.
And the hierarchy was maintained through just brutal physical cruelty.
Whips, mutilation, but also the systematic psychological destruction of the family unit. The teaching of enforced inferiority.
And yet, Zinn shows we see resistance immediately.
Always. The large-scale New York Revolt of 1712 and the Stono, South Carolina Rebellion in 1739, where rising slaves marched with drums beating and famously called out liberty.
These early organized revolts must have generated constant existential fear among the colonial elite.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a crucial structural pattern Zinn identifies.
The need for the elite to control the anger of the poor.
Specifically by preventing the poor white indentured servants and farmers from combining their forces with enslaved Africans.
And the perfect historical case study for this is Bacon's Rebellion.
In Virginia, 1676. This was a massive uprising. It included poor white frontiersmen, indentured servants, and slaves.
All angry at the government for different reasons.
Taxes, failure to protect them from Indian attacks, you name it. It was a serious cross-class and cross-racial threat to the elite plantation owners.
The rebellion was so intense the governor was actually driven out of Jamestown.
He was. And the elite realized that if these disparate, despised groups, poor whites, poor blacks, the marginalized, if they combined their power, the entire economic and social structure would just collapse.
So after violently suppressing the rebellion, the elite came up with a new strategy.
An ingenious and tragically effective strategy to prevent future cross-racial unity.
They reinforced racial hierarchy over class solidarity.
They did. But how? By gradually creating a small, more privileged white middle class, they would grant small planters certain social and civic status, like making them road overseers or jurors.
So, in essence, they offered poor white citizens a perceived status advantage,
The status of respectable citizens.
which gave them a reason to ally with the rich planters against the enslaved blacks.
It was a calculated sacrifice by the upper class. They created a racial wedge that diverted class anger and, it guaranteed the stability of the plantation economy.
And that pattern using racial division to contain class conflict, Zinn argues that's one of the most important structural arguments you can make about U.S. history.
It's fundamental to his entire thesis.
So as we transition into the revolutionary period, Zinn continues this structural critique. He challenges the myth of, national unity,
He argues the American Revolution was not a sweeping democratic uprising for everyone.
but largely a revolution of colonial elites.
Right, and what that means in practice is that the colonial leaders, they needed to deflect the existing significant anger of the poor.
The tenants, city mechanics, servants.
All of them. They needed to turn that anger away from the colonial rich who ruled locally and direct it squarely toward the British.
So the rhetoric of liberty was used to create this, false sense of fraternity between the rich and poor.
Exactly, obscuring the vast internal class divisions that were already there.
The hypocrisy is pretty startling when you look at it through Zinn's lens.
It is. You have the soaring rhetoric of natural rights, but the Continental Congress removes Thomas Jefferson's paragraph condemning the slave trade from the Declaration of Independence.
And the war effort itself was deeply class structured.
Completely. The wealthy could pay a $300 fee or just hire a substitute to avoid conscription.
While the poor were drafted to fight and die.
And the true function of this new government protecting property and creditor interests that became violently apparent right after the war ended.
With Shays' Rebellion.
With Shays' Rebellion. These were armed farmers in Massachusetts, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War itself.
And they were revolting over crippling debt and rampant foreclosures.
Right. They weren't trying to overthrow the whole government. They were just trying to stop the courts from operating to seize their land.
And the response from the new government.
Swift and brutal. Boston merchants funded a private army led by General Benjamin Lincoln to put the rebellion down.
Which just confirms Zinn's point.
It did. The new government's primary function was not securing the liberty of poor war veterans, but protecting the financial stability of the creditor class who had financed the whole war.
And that realization leads directly into the formation of the Constitution.
It does. If Shays' Rebellion proved the weakness of the Articles of Confederation to protect property, the Constitution was designed explicitly to fix that structural flaw.
The Founding Fathers were remarkably frank about this.
They were. James Madison, in Federalist Paper #10, explicitly states that a powerful representative government was needed to control factional disputes arising from the unequal distribution of property.
So, in simple terms, the Constitution was designed to contain the power of the non-property majority.
Precisely. So Zinn's question is, if the Constitution is sold as this ultimate document of democracy, how was it explicitly built to contain the majority?
You see it in the compromises.
You do. The Constitution was a compact between northern moneyed interests who wanted a strong central government to regulate interstate commerce,
And southern slaveholding interests.
who secured the continuation of the profitable slave trade for another 20 years.
Charles Beard's famous observation is central to Zinn's thinking here.
That governments aren't neutral entities. They inherently represent the dominant economic interests.
Right. And research showed that while a lot of Americans own some property, only about 3% of the population had truly vast holdings.
And Zinn argues the Constitution was designed to keep power in the hands of that tiny, wealthy percentage while creating an image of democratic control for the larger base of small property owners.
Even the initial use of central power was for elite benefit.
Look at Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary. He set up the Bank of the United States as a direct partnership between the government and specific banking interests.
So the very economic framework of the new republic was immediately geared towards serving this wealthy philosophy.
It was solidifying the power of creditors and manufacturers over poor farmers and laborers from day one.
And this pattern of using militarism to advance elite economic interests, land speculation, market expansion, it just continues seamlessly into the 19th century.
And Andrew Jackson perfectly embodied this system, a celebrated war hero, yes, but also a prolific land speculator, a merchant, and a slave trader.
The War of 1812, Zinn shows, was framed as a war for national survival.
But its true driver was expansion. Into Florida, into Canada, and, crucially, into Indian territory.
And Jackson became a national hero after fighting the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
Right, securing massive tracts of land, often with the cynical assistance of the Cherokees, who mistakenly believed they were allying with the eventual winners.
This leads to the continuation of genocide, particularly against the Cherokees.
And the ultimate betrayal here is profound because the Cherokees had adapted so much to white culture.
They developed agriculture, they invented a written language.
Sequoia did, yeah. They published a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, they adopted mills and schools.
So why does Zinn place so much emphasis on the Cherokee's successful adaptation before he describes the Trail of Tears?
Because he's highlighting the inherent nature of the conquest. It wasn't about uncivilized people refusing to change.
It was about sheer, unadulterated land hunger.
Exactly. Jackson's policy of Indian removal offered them money for the land where their fathers and friends are buried, forcing them to either leave or submit to state laws that destroyed their rights.
The resulting forced migration, the Trail of Tears, it remains one of the darkest chapters.
The Creeks, followed by the Cherokees in 1838, were forced westward, leading to massive starvation, exposure, and death.
The imagery Zinn uses from historical accounts is just horrific.
He writes that the path of the exiles could be distinguished from afar by the howling of trailing wolf packs and the circling flocks of buzzards. This was state violence, justified by economic desire.
And this pattern just immediately repeats itself with the Mexican-American War in 1846.
Zinn argues the war was deliberately provoked by the U.S. elite for continental expansion, specifically California and Texas, using these flimsy pretexts.
He even cites a U.S. soldier, Colonel Hitchcock,
who wrote in his diary, "I have said from the first that the United States are the aggressors. We have not one particle of right to be here."
What stands out here is the government's manipulation of the political process.
The war resolution was just rushed through Congress, only 2 hours of debate.
And documents supporting President Polk's claims were immediately tabled to prevent anyone from scrutinizing them.
Right, and although abolitionists denounced it as a war of conquest and rapine, and the Whigs opposed the military action, the elite consensus remained.
Expansion was the goal, they just differed on the method.
And the dissent was simply ignored by the structure of political power.
Moving into the Civil War era, Zinn insists we have to acknowledge the immense, continuous resistance of enslaved people.
Resistance wasn't passive. It included individual acts like feigning illness, breaking tools,
all the way up to massive, organized conspiracies.
Like Denmark-Vesey's in 1822 and Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, which drove the Southern elite into a state of constant panic.
So when the war finally came, Zinn highlights the deep contradictions in the Northern leadership.
Abraham Lincoln, for instance. He showed a clear reluctance to abolish slavery outright.
He said he was just trying to keep the Union intact.
Right. He publicly stated he had to bite my lips and keep quiet regarding the fugitive slave law. And his personal inclination, even after emancipation, was to send freed slaves back to Africa.
So the Civil War, in this view, was not fundamentally a moral crusade to end slavery,
but a war to retain the enormous national territory and market.
However, Zinn frames the mass desertion of slaves to the Union Army as a general strike.
And this provided a crucial manpower advantage for the North, and it crippled the Southern war economy.
That point is powerful because it reframes the whole narrative of emancipation.
It does. A Confederate planter's lament that Zinn quotes sums it up perfectly. He said, "If they were content, happy, why did they desert him in the moment of his need?"
So Zinn suggests that enslaved people effectively emancipated themselves
by leveraging the war as their opportunity to strike a blow against the plantation system.
But the freedom was tragically incomplete.
It was. During Reconstruction, despite Black participation in local government and passionate calls for land ownership.
The famous 40 acres and a mule.
Right. But the Southern white oligarchy, backed by Northern elite interests who were just seeking economic reconciliation, they quickly regained control.
And they used economic pressure and sheer terror.
The Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, mass murder, they used it all to reduce Black Americans to a state Zinn calls but little better than slavery, through sharecropping and debt peonage.
And the post-Civil War Gilded Age saw an acceleration of this pattern of wealth concentration.
An unprecedented concentration of wealth driven by a few powerful, efficient industrialists.
We're talking about vast government subsidies.
Especially for railroads, which enriched figures like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, who then controlled prices and kept wages low.
To really understand the power structure here, you have to understand the concept of interlocking directorates.
Right. This is when a small group of individuals, like Morgan, who sat on 48 corporate boards.
48.
And Rockefeller, on 37, they sit on the boards of multiple companies, even competing ones.
Ensuring interconnected control over vast segments of the national economy. The economic elite were completely unified.
And critically, Zinn argues the government acted as an active tool of this elite. The Supreme Court effectively gutted civil rights protections for Black Americans,
while at the same time using the 14th Amendment to protect corporations.
An amendment that was designed for newly freed people.
This is where Zinn's structural critique of the legal system becomes so fascinating.
By interpreting a corporation as a person, the Supreme Court began to dismantle state regulation of powerful businesses,
arguing they were being deprived of property without due process.
Zinn's takeaway is just devastatingly clear. The legal structure itself was immediately co-opted to serve capital interests. It fundamentally prioritized the rights of wealthy companies over the rights of marginalized citizens.
So even the superficial attempts at reform, like the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, they were just political gestures.
Purely. As Zinn shows, the act was designed to conciliate the critics of monopoly.
And, as its author admitted, to fend off the rise of the socialist, the communist, the nihilist.
It was a preventative measure against a class revolution, not a genuine check on corporate power.
And this concentration of wealth inevitably led to ferocious resistance.
The tumultuous railroad strikes of 1877, driven by low wages, $1.75 a day, and incredibly dangerous conditions, they just shook the nation.
The response sets a major pattern. You see this again and again.
The immediate multi-layered alliance between capital and the state. Local police, state militia, and federal troops were mobilized against the workers.
Yeah, the compliant leadership of the major railway brotherhoods actively disavowed the strike,
which demonstrates the state's willingness to use overwhelming force against organized labor.
The suppression was often based on crushing ideas, not actual crimes.
The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886 illustrates this perfectly. After a bomb explosion at a rally, 8 anarchist leaders were arrested.
And Zinn emphasizes that the evidence against them was purely their radical ideas and literature.
Not proof of guilt. They were found guilty and executed, demonstrating the state's swift, brutal ability to crush radical labor thought.
This pattern culminates with the Pullman strike in 1894.
Led by the socialist leader Eugene Debs. When that national strike expanded, the Attorney General, Richard Olney, who was a former railroad lawyer,
of course,
he obtained a court injunction against the workers, claiming they were interfering with federal mails.
And President Grover Cleveland then sent federal troops to Chicago to break the strike.
And there it is, the alliance of government, courts, and capital, now undeniable and perfectly coordinated.
These events profoundly affected the people involved. Zinn details how Debs, who initially just believed in mild reform,
he read Edward Bellamy's socialist novel, Looking Backward After Witnessing the Suppression.
And the brutality he saw firsthand converted him to unionism and eventually socialism.
It illustrates how state violence often radicalizes resistance rather than extinguishing it.
And resistance wasn't just confined to the urban factory floor.
No. In the agricultural South and West, the populist movement, rooted in the Farmers' Alliance, rose up in the 1880s and 90s.
Protesting corporate power, particularly the railroad monopolies and the concentrated wealth of financiers.
And this movement often successfully challenged big business. For example, they forced jute manufacturers to lower the exorbitant prices they charged farmers for bags.
But what Zinn finds most significant is the complex issue of race within populism.
Right. While some populists were racist, their rhetoric frequently bridged racial lines by focusing on shared class oppression.
They recognized that the poor white man and the poor black man is sitting in the same saddle today.
And this genuine cross-racial coalition posed a serious structural threat to the wealthy elite of both races in the South.
But the fate of populism illustrates yet another recurring pattern Zinn points out.
Electoral politics draining revolutionary energy.
By trying to achieve fundamental structural change through the existing two-party voting system.
The populists were eventually co-opted or defeated, preventing their radical class critique from evolving into a truly revolutionary force that could overthrow the elite structure.
Zinn also deliberately includes the history of the intimately oppressed women,
a group often rendered invisible in standard histories. The symptomatic subjection of women, this cult of true womanhood, it demanded piety, domesticity, and obedience,
which ensured they remained economically and socially dependent.
But despite this systematic control, resistance was constant and often class-conscious.
Factory women organized strikes, which they called turnouts.
We see this with the shoe workers in Lynn, Massachusetts in 1860. 10,000 strikers, including Irish and Yankee women, marched in the streets.
They were jointly rejecting the upper-class myth of success.
And the fight for women's rights was also intrinsically linked to the larger struggle for freedom.
Women like Angelina Grimke.
Right, she spoke out for women's rights within the abolitionist movement, recognizing that if they surrendered the right to speak for the slave this year, they might surrender the right to petition next year.
It was a structural understanding that all these rights are interconnected.
Absolutely. And of course, Sojourner Truth connected the dual oppression of race and sex so powerfully when she rose at a convention and asked, "And ain't I a woman?"
Zinn's goal here is to demonstrate that the struggle for equality was always multifaceted.
Uniting race, sex, and class resistance against the dominant power structure.
So by the 1890s, Zinn shows the United States reaching this critical inflection point.
The internal frontier was officially closed, and the inherent relentless need of the profit system for new markets and resources just drove the elite to look overseas.
Expansion became necessary to solve domestic problems of overproduction and recurring economic crises.
And this marks the true emergence of modern American militarism and foreign policy defined by economic interests.
The U.S. had already intervened 103 times between 1798 and 1895.
In places like Japan, Nicaragua, Hawaii, always to secure commerce and protect U.S. interests. But the scale was about to dramatically increase.
And the Spanish-American War in 1898 serves as the defining example.
It does. While the public rationale was the liberation of Cuba, Zinn's sources reveal this deep economic imperative.
A key advisor actually telegrammed President McKinley
And said, "Big corporations here now believe we will have war. Believe all would welcome it as relief to suspense."
So for the elite, war was preferable to economic uncertainty.
And the ultimate outcome just reinforced this. After the Spanish surrender, the American military deliberately ignored the Cuban rebels who had done most of the fighting.
In post-war, U.S. corporations moved in.
United Fruit, Bethlehem Steel, they quickly dominated the Cuban economy, seizing control of sugar, timber, and mineral properties. The war secured economic relief and a massive new sphere of influence, regardless of what the Cubans actually wanted.
The most brutal extension of this new imperial drive was the American-Filipino War.
President McKinley's justification for annexation was this high-minded need to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them.
But the reality on the ground was horrifying. It mirrored the conquest of Native Americans centuries earlier.
American soldiers admitted to firing the first shot, leading to what General Arthur MacArthur, the commander, confessed was overwhelming opposition.
He said he was reluctantly compelled to believe that the entire Native population was opposed to U.S. rule,
confirming that the U.S. was engaged in a cruel, expansionist war of conquest, and it was defined by superior firepower, which one British observer just called massacre and murderous butchery.
But crucially, Zinn documents widespread anti-imperialist resistance at home.
And this wasn't just wealthy intellectuals. Labor unions, including the Central Labor Unions of Boston and New York, opposed the annexation treaty.
Even black soldiers fighting in the war recognized the solidarity with the Filipinos,
noting that they are fighting manfully for what they conceive to be their best interests. This significant dissent highlighted the division between the elite's imperial ambitions and the common people's skepticism.
Around the same time, the progressive era arrived.
And Zinn analyzes this not as a genuine shift toward equality, but as a calculated structural strategy by the state to preserve the system.
By offering controlled, limited concessions.
It was a strategy of enticements and compromises designed to fight off the rising threat of radical socialism.
But this controlled reform could only go so far before corporate power responded with overwhelming violence.
The Ludlow Massacre in Colorado in 1914 epitomizes this. Striking coal miners and their families living in these tent colonies faced National Guard forces hired by the Rockefeller interests.
And the outcome was shocking. The National Guard used machine guns on the colony.
The horror was complete when rescuers found the charred bodies of 11 children and 2 women in a pit under a cot where they had been hiding.
It just exposes the deep, violent truth behind corporate power.
The resulting national protest was immense. A call to arms by the mine workers, demonstrations outside Rockefeller's New York office.
But what Zinn notes is that despite the moral outrage and the visible horror, the fundamental alliance between state authorities and corporate interests remained unbroken.
Which just demonstrates the strict limits placed on progressive-era reform.
Then we get to World War I, which Zinn argues was primarily an economic opportunity for the elite.
J.P. Morgan & Co. tied American finance directly to an Allied victory. Financiers like Bernard Baruch took direct control of the wartime economy.
The idea of prosperity was touted as classless.
But U.S. Steel alone made hundreds of millions in profit in 1916.
And to get the population to buy into this foreign war, massive ideological framing and suppression were mandatory.
The sheer scale of the government campaign, using the Committee on Public Information, the FBI, to manufacture consensus, it strongly suggests that the spontaneous feeling of the population toward the war was highly skeptical.
They had to crack down. People were encouraged to spy on and report the man who spreads pessimistic stories.
And the legal framework for this repression was the Espionage Act.
Eugene Debs, the influential socialist leader, was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Simply for giving a speech that famously and pointedly stated, "The master class has always declared the wars, the subject class has always fought the battles."
And this suppression was upheld by the highest court.
Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes used that analogy of falsely shouting fire in a theater to uphold the Espionage Act against war critics.
And Zinn shows how this clever, seemingly common-sense analogy was used to mask the systematic suppression of any organized dissent against the government's war policy.
It locked up hundreds of people and established a powerful precedent for silencing opposition during times of manufactured consensus.
Moving to WWII, Zinn's critical lens focuses on Roosevelt's actions to gain support for entry,
suggesting he was like a physician who must tell the patient lies for the patient's own good.
Again, the priority was clearly national power and imperial interest, not necessarily human rights or minority rights.
But the decision to use the atomic bomb, Zinn argues, is where the structural critique becomes most crucial for understanding modern global power.
He presents evidence from historians like Blackett and Alperovitz,
arguing that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not purely military necessities, given that Japan was already on the verge of surrender.
So what's the implication then?
Zinn suggests that the bombing was the first major operation of the Cold Diplomatic War with Russia.
It was designed to assert U.S. global dominance,
to demonstrate a terrifying, unique power before the Soviets could enter the Pacific War and potentially claim influence over Japan or surrounding regions. It was a projection of geopolitical might, prioritized over the immense human cost.
And the end of WWII immediately led into the Cold War,
which the Truman administration framed as a necessary political device.
A device used to create a liberal conservative consensus, enforcing intervention abroad and repression at home, all under the guise of fighting communism.
This anti-communist hysteria was fostered by intense prosecutions, most notoriously the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg case.
Zinn highlights the deeply troubling aspects of that case.
The unreliable testimony from key witnesses who were under immense pressure, whose stories were allegedly coordinated. The goal was clearly to establish a national mood of fear and support for the massive military and intelligence apparatus that was necessary for the Cold War.
So the Black Revolt of the 1950s and 60s, while it might have appeared sudden to too many, was rooted in a long, deep history of oppression and resistance.
Zinn notes that the memory of oppression cannot be taken away, and that's what fueled this massive new surfacing of the struggle.
A key factor, Zinn points out, again linking domestic policy to foreign policy, is the intense international pressure the U.S. faced during the Cold War.
As the U.S. was fighting communism globally, its pervasive racial discrimination at home was a massive liability. It undermined its democratic credentials.
Truman's Committee on Civil Rights explicitly cited this international embarrassment as a motivation for considering reforms.
But the true engine of change was grassroots organizing.
The sit-ins in Greensboro, the freedom rides organized by CORE, the mass demonstrations.
Zinn captures the spirit through these anecdotes, like the poignant moment when the Albany police chief asked a 9-year-old black boy his name.
And the boy looked him straight in the eye and answered, "Freedom, freedom."
But this movement crossed the line of acceptable dissent when Martin Luther King Jr. began expanding his focus beyond racial segregation to fundamental class issues,
organizing the Poor People's Encampment.
And at this point, the state reaction intensified. He was targeted by the FBI, which actively sought to destroy Dr. Martin Luther King using wiretaps and blackmail.
It just proves Zinn's pattern. The state tolerates dissent only until it fundamentally challenges the economic structure.
Which brings us to Vietnam. The war is framed as a classic example of imperial interest,
with the U.S. basically creating South Vietnam to maintain regional influence, a fact later confirmed by the Pentagon Papers.
And the violence used to achieve this influence was systemic, from napalm use to the horrifying My Lai massacre.
Zinn uses the testimony of Colonel Orrin Henderson, who was charged with covering up Miley.
And he admitted that every unit of brigade size has its Miley hidden someplace.
Which suggests that such atrocities were not isolated aberrations committed by a few rogue soldiers,
but rather an inherent, if hidden, part of the overall military strategy for controlling a hostile population.
But the resistance was equally profound and widespread.
And it went far beyond the stereotype of middle-class intellectuals. Zinn shows that blue-collar workers in places like Dearborn, Michigan, polled with strong anti-war sentiment.
And we also saw active duty soldier dissent, B-52 pilots refusing missions, veterans throwing their medals over the Capitol fence.
This massive resistance ultimately led to what we call the Vietnam Syndrome.
And for you, the listener, the Vietnam Syndrome refers to that widespread public reluctance to engage in costly, long-term foreign military interventions that lack clear objectives or direct threats to U.S. security.
And Zinn argues this public resistance proved that the consensus manufactured by the state could be overcome.
And the spirit of revolt expanded rapidly across other marginalized groups.
Women's liberation arose because despite the massive increase in working women, economic inequality persisted. The median income for working women in 1960 was still only about one-third that of men.
Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique articulated the pervasive psychological subjection women faced.
The problem that has no name.
And resistance took the form of creative, direct action.
We see radical women protesting Miss America by throwing symbolic items like bras and girdles into a freedom trash can.
And the group Witchy's Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell protesting the stock exchange.
And Zinn is sure to include the organizing efforts of poor Black women who connected their domestic struggles directly to the need for fundamental social change.
Even in the nation's prisons, rebellion erupted, culminating in the 1971 Attica Uprising,
where prisoners demanded human rights and basic necessities. Zinn notes that these uprisings were driven by a profound realization
that government authorities who were bombing countries and violating civil rights committed greater crimes than the prisoners themselves.
Their crime was systemic, not individual.
Native American groups, long thought to be silenced, mobilized strongly as well.
The 1969 occupation of Alcatraz Island, protesting broken treaties and poverty, sought to make the island a center for Native American studies.
Even Vietnam veterans of Indian descent drew connections,
noting the same massacres happened to the Indians 100 years ago. This reinforced Zinn's point that the history of conquest and resistance is continuous.
Zinn then uses Watergate as an example of the establishment protecting itself. It revealed deep political manipulation.
Illegal wiretaps, CIA misuse, massive corporate bribery from ITT.
But the press and political leaders quickly celebrated Nixon's resignation by proclaiming the system is working.
And Zinn argues this narrative left the structural power of the presidency completely intact, particularly its ability to invoke national security to protect military and diplomatic secrets, a power affirmed by the Supreme Court.
So the true mechanisms of corporate and military power were never really dismantled.
And the systemic protection of the wealthy just accelerated under Reagan and subsequent administrations. Tax reforms, often supported by both parties, drastically lowered the top rate on the very rich,
down to 28% from WWII highs.
Simultaneously, there was a bipartisan attack on welfare programs, which successfully diverted public attention from massive military spending.
The contrast is staggering, and Zinn highlights it explicitly.
Funding a single $1.5 billion Trident submarine project versus the potential for a 5-year global child immunization program.
The priority was clearly military power.
And the justification for foreign policy remained the assertion of U.S. global dominance, demonstrated by invasions like Grenada in '83 and Panama in '89.
What's critical here is Zinn's observation that there was a historic pattern of Democrats supporting military intervention,
which ensured a bipartisan consensus on empire that shielded the military-industrial complex from any serious congressional opposition.
So when George H.W. Bush launched the Gulf War in 1991, his determination was explicitly to overcome the Vietnam Syndrome.
To overcome that public reluctance to engage in foreign wars by making the war swift and decisive.
And yet, resistance was immediate and widespread.
The speed of the war was designed to prevent a national anti-war movement, but dissent appeared right away.
Demonstrators chanted, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, we won't fight for a VOCO,"
demonstrating an immediate, sophisticated understanding that the war was fundamentally about economics and oil corporations.
And grassroots activism continued to challenge corporate and military power.
Proving the existence of what Zinn calls a permanent adversarial culture outside mainstream politics.
We see the rise of living wage campaigns, the massive Seattle WTO protests in 1999 that focused on corporate domination over labor and the environment.
And the founding of street newspapers to challenge media narratives.
Finally, the razor-thin 2000 election, decided by Supreme Court intervention, reinforced Zinn's thesis on the continuity of elite power.
Despite the political spectacle, the fundamental system, from Clinton affirming essential continuity in American foreign policy to the political structure protecting corporate interests, it remained firmly tethered to corporate and military power, regardless of which major party won the presidency.
And this leaves us with Zinn's ultimate message about history and current events.
When narratives of strong wartime leadership or national security emerge, especially after events like 9/11, they serve a primary purpose:
to justify continued massive military spending and intervention,
and preventing the fundamental changes needed to address pressing social needs like poverty and inequality.
So to sum it all up, Howard Zinn's monumental contribution is really urging us to adopt a structural critique and a class consciousness.
His work is vital because he forces us to see history through the eyes of the marginalized, of women, labor, blacks, Native Americans, and to recognize their infinite, persistent capacity for resistance against overwhelming odds.
And that structural critique reveals that these all-encompassing symbols like patriotism, national defense, and democracy are often used to mask fundamental conflicts of interest and maintain elite control.
Right. So critical thinking isn't just an academic exercise. It is crucial for evaluating these historical and current narratives that prioritize stability and profit over human life.
Zinn's conclusion is, it's radical.
It is. To solve severe economic problems and the cycle of violence, he says we need fundamental change, a coordinated effort to reconstruct the economy away from corporate and military control and toward human need.
And this massive, almost utopian movement is held out as possible only because of
the enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist.
And that is the final provocative thought to leave you with, straight from this deep dive. If American history is not simply a story of inevitable elite dominance, but an infinite story of resistance, what unexpected surprise might the coordinated capacity of ordinary people yield next?